Can I congratulate those of you who have braved wind, flood, and the railway network to get here, particularly anyone who's come from Cornwall, although I'm not sure that would be many, or even the Thames Valley. For those who swum here, particular thanks for turning up. Tonight we've got the euro, and the Observer 3 weeks ago described me as an affable Eurosceptic. Well, I hope by the time that you've finished listening to me, you can conclude that at least part of that statement was untrue. I leave it to you to guess which part. Next month I will deal with domestic economic policy in the UK, and the final lecture on the 30th of April will deal with a much more important subject than economics, which is cricket. So let me start. The Delors report, I don't know if any of you remember Up Yours Delors from The Sun, in 1989, that set up economic and monetary union for the Eurozone, mentioned neither globalization nor China. And neither did the first official European plan for monetary union, which was the Werner Plan in 1970. And although the document is not available on the internet for a suitable word search, I think we can safely assume that the very first plan for the euro, which was set up by Hitler, the Chart plan, Chart was Hitler's economic guru, and in many ways was the predecessor of the plan for the euro, I think we can assume that that didn't mention globalization and that didn't mention China either. In retrospect, this looks like a huge omission. This is because globalization has proved to be a huge asymmetric shock to the Eurozone. An asymmetric shock is one of those things that causes real problems for fixed exchange zones because it is an economic shock that affects areas differentially. So I will start by showing how Europe's preference for the comfortable life and for cushioning people from some of the pressures of the real world has affected its competitiveness. And in turn, this has led to disappointing growth, which has at best underperformed expectations, and in the case of Italy, disappeared entirely. It is the combination of slow growth and the growing cost of public services that cushion the pressures of economic life that has caused government spending in Europe to get out of kilter as a share of GDP, which in turn has led to the Eurozone government debt crisis. I'll then look at the differential international trading performance between the different Eurozone economies, using trade with China as an example. I will show how some countries, in effect, compete with the Chinese, while others provide the goods which the Chinese really want to buy. And this has meant that globalization has very diverse effects on the Eurozone, pressures that would normally be met by currency adjustment. The alternative is the painful step of internal devaluation, which destroys consumer demand as it reduces wages. But having shown how globalization has underpinned the major challenge to the euro, I will then show how it's also bailed the euro out. We've done some detective work for the first time in this lecture series on the role of Chinese investment of their foreign currency holdings in euros to bail out the stricken currency and its bonds after the crisis of 2010-2011. While outright monetary transactions, and I will explain a lot more about them later, were the signal for the change in sentiment, they have not actually had to be used. And of course, it's now the case that following the decision by the German Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe last week, it's possible that they can't be used. But the euro does appear to have been bailed out despite this anyway. I will conclude by looking at the future of the euro and also at whether the UK, which will allegedly have a referendum on staying in the EU, should do so. Globalization has changed the whole world economy, and my case for claiming it's the world's greatest ever economic event is based not just on its pervasiveness, though anything affecting 2/3 of the world's population must be pretty pervasive, but also on its speed. And because so much of it has happened within the lifetime of a single individual, it means that many in the emerging world still have the attitudes of people who are used to poverty at a time when they have become prosperous. So they work harder, take fewer holidays, and give far more importance to sustaining economic growth in their public policy, and far less priority to cushioning economic discomfort than we do in the West. And although I am sure that they will adjust and become more like us over time, they're likely to adjust much more slowly than would be convenient for us who are facing their competition. The rise of the emerging economies resulting from globalization has hit Europe's competitiveness badly. We work shorter hours than anyone else in the world. We take longer holidays than anyone else in the world. We tax employment to pay for our social policies, and because of that, partially, we have the highest unemployment in the world. We also have the earliest retirement ages in the world and the highest age for starting work in the world, which means that many European countries have a remarkably short working lifetime to go with a remarkably short working year. Meanwhile, the emerging economies are competing not just on cheap labor, but increasingly on a combination of, admittedly not quite so cheap, but still low labor costs, and increased productive capacity. To take the example of China, as it moves up the technical ladder, it is massively expanding the product range where it competes against the European countries. According to a measure called the Complementarity Index for European and Chinese Exports, which I think is based on World Bank analysis, although it's not quite clear, the EU in 2012 was in direct competition with China on 35% of the 5,775 products that were categorized, compared with 15% only 12 years earlier in 2000. So it had more than doubled over a 12-year period. Let me divert here to deal with a red herring that is sometimes raised at this point. I'm most emphatically not telling in people what to do about the hours that they work or the holidays that they take. The hours that people work should be their own decision, unless they work in a sector where long hours impose risks on the general public. But the decisions that people make over hours and salary are a trade-off. And when a new economic factor like globalization appears, this trade-off changes. And because we are competing with people who currently have a different economic model from us and who are likely to have such for some time to come, we need to factor this in to the decisions that we make when we trade hours worked for income. Where things get distorted in Europe is that when the costs of shorter hours or not working at all are paid for not by the person making the decision, whether or not to work or for how long to work, but by other taxpayers. And, of course, increasing numbers of people not working are being paid for by people who do work, raising the taxes on those who do work, and putting them at a competitive disadvantage. There is a risk that this leads to what I called in my April lecture last year, the misery cycle, where an increasingly uncompetitive economy puts up taxes on the competitive bits, and so more and more of the economy becomes uncompetitive. Now, the table in this slide shows annual working hours for a range of countries. It shows pretty clearly that we in Europe work fewer hours than people in North America, in Latin America, and, of course, in Asia. However, it also shows what, for my argument, is an extremely inconvenient fact, which is that the most successful economies in Europe tend to work the shortest hours. Now, I've always said that economics needs to be combined with common sense. And that's why academic economists in the UK have contributed so little to our economic knowledge. It would be easy to conclude from this that, at least for Europe, the less you work, the more successful you will be. But of course, this is a classic chicken and egg problem. If you are more economically successful, you can afford to take more of the fruits of your success in shorter hours, particularly if there are high marginal rates of taxation which penalize those that work long hours. And common sense tells us that for people to assume that the fewer hours they work, the more successful they will be, is just plain daft. On the other hand, I do think that we in Europe have in many ways a much better lifestyle and balance between work and leisure than our equivalents in the US, for example, let alone Asia, who seem to me to take too few holidays. And particularly in the US, that problem seems to me to be compounded by the fact that when they do take holidays, they typically take them in their comfort zone and indeed in their own country, and so learn much less about what is going on in other places. But we in Europe also have a problem, which is that there is an economic cost to our relatively short working hours and working life and comfortable lifestyles. And unless we adjust to the new economy that's emerging as a result of globalization, there is a risk of us ending up trapped in the misery cycle where fewer people are supporting more people, with more taxes raised on those who are still working, which makes them uncompetitive, and so the numbers get less. Let me turn now to labour costs. There's surprisingly little good data on hourly labour costs that properly compares on a like-for-like basis the cost of people doing equivalent jobs in very different parts of the world. But I've managed to find on the internet a firm called Werner International Management Consultants, who appear to be reputable, though I hadn't heard of them until I was looking for this data. And they've made such a comparison for the primary textile industry. And for the bits I know something about, their numbers look sensible. Now, textiles typically are a relatively low-paid part of the economy, so I would not treat the data here as truly representative of the whole economy. But at least we're comparing like with like. And the data, especially for the emerging economies, is fascinating. I'm sorry I've had to split the data table into two slides. And even then, I suspect many of you will find the chart difficult to read, so I will highlight the key points. What it shows is how much hourly labor in this industry costs in different parts of the world. The most expensive, and I'm sure any of you who ski will know this, is Switzerland, where the cost is nearly $50 an hour. Germany and France are around $30 an hour. We in the UK, $20 an hour. In the US, and of course textile work is mainly in the south, where traditionally the cotton was grown, the cost is $17.50. In Korea and Taiwan, which are essentially developed economies, the cost is roughly $10, and not much more in Israel, which is also a developed economy. Much of the data on this page of the slide is well known and confirmed by international studies from the normal sources of such data, as the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, who sadly have discontinued their international comparison series, and the OECD. It's the second page of the slide where it gets interesting, because we're dealing with data which is much harder to get. What you can see is that China is up to $2.10 an hour, and roughly as expensive as Thailand, and more so than Malaysia. At the bottom of this table are 4 countries where they have high birth rates and, as a result, cheap labor: Indonesia, Vietnam, India, and Pakistan. Here, hourly wages are $1 an hour or less. In 2009, Nike shut down its factory in Suzhou, China. That's a place that formerly was known as Suzhou. It sounds a bit like a maiden name, really. And moved it to Vietnam. This table shows why. Last year, Adidas also shut down its factory in China, also in Suzhou, and moved it to Myanmar, where years of misgovernment have led to wages that are even lower than in Vietnam. Now, I've done quite a lot of search, and it appears that the representative wage in December last year in Myanmar was 12 cents an hour. Admittedly, the workers were striking for an increase to 15 cents an hour, but still very low by even the standards of China and Asia, let alone Western standards. Although labour costs are rising in emerging markets, and especially so in China, where there is a demographic problem resulting from the one-child policy, they are still massively below ours, and especially in Europe. One of the results of this is that Europe is becoming a much smaller part of the world economy. The CEBR's World Economic League table, which I referred to last month and which we released on December the 26th, shows how Western Europe is reducing as a share of the world economy. In 1998, Western Europe was 30.1% of the world economy. Our forecast for 2028 is that its share will have more than halved to 14.5%. Now, obviously, all advanced economies are losing shares of world GDP as a result of the rise of the emerging economies, but the loss of share is much greater for Europe. By comparison, the North American share over the same period only falls back from 31.8% to 22.1%. To put this in perspective, in 1998, the North American economy was only 5.6% bigger than the Western European economy. By 2028, we forecast that it would be 52.4% bigger. I apologize for the spurious precision. These are the numbers that came out of the Excel sheet, and I haven't rounded them. But you get the idea anyway. And clearly, we won't be precisely right on this. Europe's lack of competitiveness has, especially in the present century, started to hinder growth. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, in its World Economic Outlook, covers 188 countries. And most of us use this World Economic Outlook as a particularly invaluable data source for the more obscure economies, which we don't forecast ourselves. Now, if you look at these 188 countries, only 3 of the countries have had no growth in the present century. They are Italy, San Marino, which for economic purposes is part of Italy, and Zimbabwe. There are only 23 countries, including the 3 mentioned above, which have had less than 20% growth in the current century. 12 of these are in the EU, and all but 1, that's Denmark, are in the Eurozone. And the 11 countries outside the EU that are in the same growth league table are Zimbabwe, as mentioned above, Micronesia, the Central African Republic, Jamaica, Barbados, the Bahamas, Japan, Haiti, Antigua, Libya, Tuvalu, and Tonga. There are 4 countries for whom data is not available for the whole period: Iraq, Afghanistan, Southern Sudan, and Syria. Of these, the first 2 definitely have been growing for the past decade, for which data is available, though very much based on external support, at least in the Afghan case. Southern Sudan only came into existence recently, and Syria was growing until the Civil War started, though I would guess that the Civil War has probably made their growth performance over the whole of the 21st century at least as bad as Italy's, or maybe worse. Now, I list these countries because it's important to see whose company we are keeping in the slow lane. With the greatest respect to the government and peoples of these countries, other than Japan, where the impact of economic stagnation is well known, they are not household names for economic success. Now, it is true that, other than for Italy, Europe's lack of competitiveness has not yet caused growth to go negative in aggregate. But as I pointed out in my last lecture, living standards in the Western world are now growing noticeably more slowly than GDP, so that many of these 12 economies in Western Europe with slow growth will have had living standards that have been either declining or, at best, relatively static. Now, we are likely to get some good news on Friday when we get the flash estimate for Eurozone GDP for the 4th quarter of last year. We're expecting growth for that quarter of 0.3%, led by Germany, but with France pulling the total down. But even if Europe gets back to positive economic growth in the coming years, growth will still be so slow that CEBR's official recommendation is not to go out and buy the champagne yet, even if you're a European bureaucrat or MEP and can get it on expenses. Now, analysis of fixed exchange rate systems pays great attention to the impact of what we call asymmetric shocks. These are shocks which affect the different countries in the fixed exchange rate differentially. And the analysis here looks at the different trading patterns in the different parts of the EU, and particularly the Eurozone. And to simplify things, I've focused on trade with China. Now, the first thing to note is the point I've already made, which is that China is moving rapidly up the technology curve and is now competing against more than twice the share of EU exports that it did in the year 2000. But looking forward is a much more serious challenge, because we estimate on our World Economic League Table forecasts that by 2028, China will compete with 75% of the products that we export in Europe. Now, this looks at the EU in aggregate, but the asymmetry of shocks lies not in its aggregate size, but in the differential effects for different parts of the EU. Now, partly this reflects different product sets. I mentioned the World Bank covers 5,775 different products. The larger European economies export about 4,000 of them. The smaller economies export no more than half that, at about 2,000 different products. The World Bank has a measure of trade complementarity, which is a complex measure, but it looks at whether the exports from one country are more likely to compete with exports from another or not. And it shows that 46% of German exports are complementary with Chinese goods, whereas only 22% of Irish exports are complementary. Now, the Germans make things like machine tools and high-quality branded cars that the Chinese want to buy, whereas at the other extreme, the textile industry, which not so long ago was a staple part of industry in southern Europe, has been all but wiped out, except at the high end in Europe, by competition from low-cost producers. And what this means is that globalization has affected the different European economies differentially. And this has greatly exacerbated the problems since the euro was started on the 1st of January 1999, just as globalization was getting into full swing. Now, normally, exchange rate flexibility is one of the cushions to the pain of asymmetric shocks. But in a fixed exchange rate system, this isn't there. Instead, the countries that are having problems have to rely on internal devaluation, which is a very painful process because it involves cutting wages which damage domestic consumer spending at the same time as boosting exports and curbing imports. And it's this squeeze which is one of the reasons why southern Europe, in the shape of Italy, Portugal, and Greece, have had the slowest growth in the world, excluding Zimbabwe, in the 21st century. The slower-than-expected growth in Europe, combined with lax fiscal discipline embedded in the euro system, meant that the weaker economies in Europe built up unsustainable deficits, which accumulated into unsustainable debts. Weaker-than-expected growth meant that governments implemented spending plans that then could not be financed. Not only did government spending rise as a share of GDP, it reached 57% last year in France, which is now only very slightly below the shares of public spending that we were used to in Eastern Europe before the fall of the Iron Curtain. But also, weak growth meant that tax receipts were disappointing. And of course, the lower-than-expected denominator means that both deficits and debts as a share of GDP have also been higher than expected. So the combination of excess spending and revenue shortfalls led to deficits which accumulated into debt, which was the trigger for the euro crisis. Now, my key point here is that the economic crisis in Europe is much more systemic than it appears. And although the euro has contributed to the crisis, it's not the main cause. The euro itself has contributed to the crisis in three different ways. First, as mentioned before, The nature of competitive problems, and especially asymmetric shocks, is that they normally need exchange rate adjustments to cushion the blow. The fixed exchange rates intrinsic to the euro meant that this did not happen. It could be argued that the international exchange rate for the euro is about right for Germany, but it is clearly too high for many of the other European countries. And because the exchange rate was not available to make this adjustment, we had this internal devaluation, to which I've referred already. This in turn hit living standards and hence consumption. Second, the existence of the effective currency guarantee meant that many Eurozone economies, which had got used to high interest rates because of their weak economies, suddenly found themselves with German interest rates, which were way below what they were used to. In two countries in particular, Ireland and Spain, these low interest rates led to a wildly excessive building boom and bust that left them with large amounts of empty property and a collapse in property values, which in turn created banking crises, which in turn added to the costs of the government debt problem. Third, the weakness of the fiscal scrutiny mechanisms embodied within the euro meant that the weaker economies were given plenty of rope to hang themselves. Had they had independent currencies, the currency market certainly would have pulled the plug on their policies much earlier, and the problems would have been very much more intense. But just to summarize all this, although I think the euro has exacerbated the difficulties, I doubt if GDP in the weaker economies would have been hugely higher today, even without the euro, because I think the problems are much more fundamental. The euro has certainly added to the volatility, but I'm not sure it's so much. It's massively exacerbated the situation. It has exacerbated them a bit. So all this means that tinkering with the euro will only do a certain amount to solve Europe's economic problems. And even breaking up the euro will solve some problems, but at the expense of making things worse in the short term. Countries leaving the euro would have no currency at all for a short while, for a few weeks at least, and the markets would almost certainly overreact by excessively devaluing the weaker of the new currencies that emerged and excessively revaluing the stronger ones. Although I'm reasonably certain that Europe in 10 years would be better off without the euro, the path over that 10-year period would be a very bumpy one. Now let me turn to how the euro crisis got solved, at least temporarily. The crisis really got going in late 2009 when concerns rose in the financial markets that Greece would default. They peaked in May 2012 when successive elections failed to produce a government in Greece that would take the decisions that would satisfy lenders. But after the announcement of outright monetary transactions by the incoming European Central Bank Chairman Mario Draghi on the 2nd of August 2012, and with Greece eventually finding a government that at least pretended to be making the fiscal adjustments demanded by its creditors, the crisis has subsided. Ironically, the outright monetary transaction facilities have not actually had to be used. But the mere threat that the European Central Bank might mount what market traders call a bear squeeze, which is about as unpleasant as it sounds, on speculators speculating against the government bonds of the weaker European currencies has been enough to permit bond yields in the weaker economies to fall back. Today, or more precisely yesterday when I checked the data, the yield on Greek government 10-year bonds had fallen back to 7.53%, compared with a peak in March 2012 of more than 12%, while the yield on Italian bonds of the same maturity was 3.68%, against a peak of 4.85%. What saved the euro was that once the hedge funds had liquidated their positions for fear that they'd get caught in the bear squeeze, the recovery was enough to persuade the Chinese to start to invest their foreign exchange reserves in euro-denominated assets, as well as making transactions in the bonds of the weaker economies. Now, it is very well known that China has accumulated huge foreign exchange reserves as part of its policy of keeping the renminbi on a stable path. In January 2014, Chinese forex reserves were $3.8 trillion. The composition of Chinese forex reserves is a state secret, but it is possible to do some detective work on this and work out rough percentages. Now, this slide shows China's forex holdings by currency estimated by two gentlemen, Wang Yongzhong and Duncan Freeman, over the period to 2011. This report was issued in March 2013. Now, what's happened since then? Well, we have had some clues from the Chinese government. In contrast to the widespread skepticism vis-à-vis the euro, mainly stemming from the sort of slightly Anglo-American-centered financial markets, Chinese leaders have consistently been more optimistic, intervening on a number of occasions since the beginning of the euro crisis to reassure financial markets and European leaders that they would continue to buy eurozone bonds and bolster the common currency. Political considerations have also played a role. Chinese leaders have traditionally supported a stronger and more united Europe that could work alongside Beijing to counterbalance American hegemony. In March 2009, Zhu Shaochan, the then People's Bank of China governor, explicitly called for the creation of a new international reserve currency while reiterating China's support for the euro. The Chinese government explicitly backed the European Financial Stability Facility, the EFSF, which was replaced in October 2012 by the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM, which is a fund of 440 billion euros, the rescue fund for Portuguese, Greek, and Irish government bonds. And commentators generally think that China has been buying euros. There's a gentleman, or possibly a lady, called Nicola Casarini, who is a senior analyst at the Paris-based European Union Institute for Security Studies, and he or she, depending on the gender, estimated that by March 2013, the proportion of Chinese reserves invested in Europe had risen to about a third from its traditional 25 to 30%. Note that this definition is slightly different from that used by the authors of the previous slide. And in October 2013, the People's Bank of China and the European Central Bank announced their first currency swap deal. It's no coincidence that this followed the opening of the Shanghai Free Trade Zone in the same month. Meanwhile, an analysis by Dow Jones Newswires has also confirmed the trend of the Chinese government shifting reserves to euros. Now, our own work has tried to put together the pieces of the jigsaw, and there are certainly quite a lot of missing pieces. But balancing movements in Chinese reserves with market movements in currencies and bond yields. And our tentative conclusion is that the proportion of Chinese foreign exchange reserves in euros is now about 38%, close to 40% in other words, compared with the historic 25 to 30%. And most of this rise has happened since mid-2012. If this is correct, it is clear that China has saved the euro, at least temporarily. There is, of course, no shortage of conspiracy theories for why the Chinese might like Europeans to be in their debt. But actually, China's support for the euro is in China's interest anyway. The Chinese have never liked the dollar's status as the main reserve currency, and therefore a strong interest in strengthening rivals to the dollar. But this policy is given added momentum by the gradual emergence of the renminbi as a major currency in its own right. Renminbi will ultimately be the world's first or second currency, but it's currently held back by its limited acceptability. And so it makes sense for the Chinese to support the euro as an alternative to the dollar, possibly as a bit of a stalking horse, until the renminbi becomes much more internationally tradable. So globalization was probably the single most important explanatory factor behind the euro crisis, but it was one of the consequences of globalization, which is the Chinese accumulated reserves, that saved the euro from being wrecked as the markets took against it 2 years ago. Now, this is all not entirely good news for the Eurozone. First, even if there is no conspiratorial explanation for the Chinese holdings, it still places Europe in Chinese debt and subject to Chinese pressure. Secondly, when the Chinese feel confident about the international tradability of the renminbi, it does slightly suggest that their interest in supporting the euro may be less strong than it is today. And even though the intensity of the market speculation against the euro has gone away, economic growth remains anemic, and a longer-term solution will be required. So what I pointed out so far is that Europe's economic problem transcends the euro. Getting rid of the euro would change its dimensions, but many of the problems would not go away, and getting rid of the euro would create its own problems in the short term, though our calculations show that European GDP would be higher if the euro was scrapped within 10 years, and possibly even within 5 years. But a longer-term solution for the euro will probably involve transfers within Europe. As I've mentioned in my November 2012 lecture, I was effectively apprenticed as a young economist to a very great gentleman called Sir Donald MacDougall, he turned out to be my predecessor as the chief economic advisor to the Confederation of British Industry. Now, Sir Donald was a great man. He'd been Churchill's economic advisor during the war, and he'd been the government's chief economic advisor before getting promoted to be the CBI's chief economic advisor. At least that's the way we tried to spin it. And Sir Donald, at the same time as being the CBI's chief economic advisor, was commissioned by the European Commission to write what was naturally called the McDougall Report, which was published in April 1977. And the McDougall Report looked at the role of fiscal transfers between different countries in Europe and pointed out how tiny it was compared with the transfers that took place within member states. Now, that comment is even more so today. For example, our own work shows that a fifth of all the income earned in London is transferred to other parts of the United Kingdom. Now, the McDougall Report concluded that to integrate European public spending, to integrate Europe, which is not here, public spending of about 20 to 25% of GDP would be necessary at an EU level, compared with the 1.2% we currently have. Now, despite being a Blairite, and Donald told me over lunch during the last week of his life before he died at the age of 91, a week when, besides these lunches, he also went out an evening 4 times. What a man. But he told me that he thought Tony Blair had been Britain's best ever prime minister. So that was his sort of general political perspective. But despite that, he was vehemently opposed to the single currency because he believed that the single currency could not work without transfers between rich and poor countries on something like the scale that would be implied by having public expenditure of roughly a quarter of GDP at a European level. Now, following this, there is an obvious trade that would sustain the euro in the longer term, even though the pressures from globalization are set to increase. Long-term transfers from the richer economies to the poorer economies, combined with much more intensive economic control by the creditor countries of the budgetary positions of the debtor countries, could make the euro sustainable. But this places the long-term future of the euro squarely in the hands of the voters. Will the Germans and other richer economies vote for long-term transfers? Will the weaker economies be prepared to give up the economic sovereignty to the richer countries that would be implied by this? And I believe it's the answers to those 2 questions that will determine whether the euro survives. Now, finally, what about the UK? There is a possible referendum in the offing in 2017, although I'm not by any means convinced it will actually happen. Is it in our interest to remain members of the EU? The Swiss have already voted in a referendum this week to break their single market treaty with the EU on the subject of immigration, imposing quotas on immigrants, though by an extremely tight majority. The yes was 50.3%, or I think it was a no, actually, but it's the one that voted against immigration. The response of the EU is yet to be seen, but they will respond to Switzerland with one eye on the United Kingdom. Now, CBR is carrying out some work on the subject. We will know more when the work is complete. We have, in fact, been commissioned for some reason by both the pro-EU forces and the anti-EU forces to study different aspects of the issue. And that actually fits quite well with our current view, that the impact of staying in or leaving is remarkably finely balanced. What is clear is that if we were to leave, the negative impacts would happen very quickly, while the positive effects would take much longer to emerge. I certainly don't know at this stage how I would vote if there were to be a referendum, but I suspect it will depend on two things. First, how much the EU itself will have to adjust to keep the Eurozone together. And secondly, how far they're prepared to go in adjusting the UK's terms of membership, which increasingly do not suit the UK, and have really not done so since Monsieur Barnier became the Single Market Commissioner with his avowed aim of attacking the City of London. While there are plenty of things in the City of London that need reform, Monsieur Barnier is not the solution. So these things, I think, will determine whether being in or pulling out are in Britain's interest. I hope this sets aside Will Hutton's description of me a few weeks ago in The Observer as an affable Eurosceptic. I'm not feeling terribly affable this evening, but I don't think either I'm a Eurosceptic. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.